welcome to Engineers Workshop. I wanted to do a quick video that's just basically a shout out to two good friends of mine who did some work for me for the channel. And the first I'm sure you've heard of, his name is Steve Summers. Steve spent, it was like 3 videos fixing a couple of broken parts off of my 16-inch Monarch lathe. And I'll put a link in the bottom of the video to those videos on his channel. And the second is a gentleman by the name of Joe Frye. Joe Frye's channel is called Machining 360. And Joe is also restoring a 16-inch Monarch. His model is a CY, mine's a CW, by the way. And he saw an older video of mine where I designed a couple of thin wall bushings to go under some commercial thrust bearings. And these were to go in place of the original OEM Monarch parts, which when I priced them out were over $600. So that wasn't going to fly. And I did an attempt at making some crude ones myself with a Craftsman drill press. And he saw the video and wanted to try to do that fix also for his lathe, and ended up making me some bushings in the process. So let me zoom you in and show you all these parts. So this is the shifter for the quick change gearbox. And I don't know if my lathe was tipped over at one point, but this boss was broken off completely. What I had was I had half of a plunger boss and nothing sticking out here. So I sent Steve another lever, and this was off the apron, I believe, one of the apron's direction selectors. That had the correct geometry on the boss, and all of these appeared to be the same. And so based on this and some measurements and a drawing I sent to him, Steve duplicated another boss out of a piece of gray cast iron that I sent him, and fixtured this thing. You know, there's no good way to hold it, so he come up with a way to hold it, roughed out the part, and then married it up and finished it off, and it just came out beautifully. Beautiful braze work. He cleaned everything off. And then the other part that Steve worked on for me was this. And this is it's called a draw lever. My lathe has a taper attachment, and the draw lever actually attaches to the underside of the taper attachment. And it has this funky notch here to clear the casting, and then a threaded rod that has 4 jam nuts, and they trap a bed clamp, and the bed clamp and these jam nuts will hold the carriage of the taper attachment in place while the while the cross slide of the lathe traverses, and it'll draw the compound in and out based on what angle you have the taper attachment set to. So this was completely broken. I was lucky I even found these parts. This one was still bolted to the underside of the taper attachment, but I thought that the rest of this was gone. And I had grabbed up a bunch of parts. This lathe was in the woods that looked like they belonged to the lathe, and I really it didn't even register when I saw this piece with the 4 jam nuts on it what it was. But it turned out to be the missing piece to the draw rod. So Steve married those up and brazed them, and I'm back in business. I got to get all these components cleaned up and painted and ready to go back together. Now Joe made some other parts for me. This is a piece of 12mm OD hydraulic line tubing, and these are some bushings that he made. Let me give you a little bit of backstory again. There's a set of thrust bearings on either end of the lead screw that moves the cross slide in the compound. It actually traps a little thrust block at the back there near that taper attachment. And those thrust bearings on my lathe were shot. They were, all rusty. The races were pitted up. Half the balls were missing. So I priced them out from Monarch, and they priced them out individually, like a thrust disc the cage, a thrust disc, and these things added up to over $600. I said, there's got to be a commercially available bearing that will fit. Turns out there wasn't, but there was a metric bearing. There was a metric thrust bearing with a 12 millimeter bore, which was a little bit too big. The ID of the bearings on the lathe were 7/16. So I said, well, if I make a bushing that goes inside the ID of the thrust bearing, then that'll bush it down and keep it concentric with the shaft. And those were like $4.50 from VXB. So I drew up the part after I modeled it in SolidWorks, and I made a couple of these bushings. I hesitate to call them bushings, on my Craftsman drill press, and I made a fixture to keep everything concentric. But if you look at this, I'm measuring with a set of Mitutoyo ball nose mics. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. These are digital, but they're old school digital. And you can see that I've got, let me try to get it where you can read the dial, 18.5, 16.5, 14.5, 11.5, 16, 17, 19. So I go from about 19.5 thousandths to 11.5 thousandths, 9.5 thousandths variation in that wall. You can almost look at it and see the thick and the thin. But like I said, I was working with a Craftsman drill press. Now, Joe saw the video, and I sent him my print, and I sent him extra pieces of the tube and the reamer that I had, and he made these beautiful little bushings properly on his lathe, on one of his lathes. And I'm not checking his work because I knew he would do great, but these things came out with basically less than, there's like 17, 16.5, 16, basically a 0.5 thousandths variation, no matter how you check them. So with a 0.5 thousandths wall variation, you're talking only 2.5 tenths ID to OD offset. So that's essentially immeasurable. Beautiful little bushings. He made me 4, even though the lathe only uses 2. And I hope he made himself, enough. But these go inside the 12 millimeter VXB thrust bearings and take up the additional play that those have. It's going to put my lathe back in service. So thank you very much, Joe, for this. And thank you, Steve, for all of the parts that you fixed for me. And I will catch you next time on Engineer's Workshop.